Hey everybody, day 44 of the vlog. Finally back with Luke. We had a bit of a hiatus there after the chaos of traveling and doing a education conference during the school year, which was a first for me at least. It took a while to get caught up.
I think me too, actually.
Yeah.
Kind of throws things off.
Like to sleep after a conference.
Yeah.
Because you don't do a lot of that on those because you're just, learning so much and not at all because of the fun you're having at night.
Yeah, it wasn't the Bulls game. That wasn't.
No, it wasn't that. But we're back into the primer for anti-racist white educators, and we are now up to Principle 6.
Accountability. So the idea here is that it's easy to let the work slide, to prioritize other things, and a lot of that has to do with the privilege that we have of being cis white males. We don't walk the life every day where we have to be super aware of our identities. And so I think in the work to try to deconstruct white supremacy, we have to be really intentional about holding ourselves and each other accountable to staying engaged in the work, because it doesn't hit us in the face when we walk out the door.
Yeah, and I think, this is one where just a couple of weeks ago I was talking to a colleague that's a woman of color, and she was talking about being in a room where really like whiteness was being centered, and yet nobody else was like talking about it. And these are all people that have had a lot of racial equity training that believe it, but they weren't kind of stepping up to the plate. And she did a pretty phenomenal job of holding people accountable to this work and to this conversation. I think it's really important to, like we've mentioned this before when we talked about learn, that it's not the responsibility of people of color to always be keeping you accountable, but that is something that you want to be aware of, especially if you're doing work in an all-white space, and with all white colleagues, that there does need to be some type of accountability to people of color. That could be an organization that you're working with, that could be an expertise that you compensate for their time to be able to evaluate that. Whatever it is, just always make sure that you're not presuming on people of color to be doing the work for you or to be putting in that effort.
Yeah, and we talk about building our equity muscle, as this is something that's uncomfortable, especially for white folks, to engage in. Deconstructing white supremacist systems is difficult and sometimes hard for people to understand how they operate within that system, because it's working in a way that we don't see it every day. And so in building our equity muscle, it's helpful, Terry's using this, I'm totally stealing it, but to have a spotter, to have someone who will hold you accountable for keeping you engaged and helping you grow through the process. And I think that's another part of this accountability too. Terry's been that for me. I've got some other folks who will, sometimes call you out, like, hey, we got to do this. Let's get re-engaged in this project we're working on, or whatever it might be. And that's another part of this accountability too.
Yeah, absolutely. And the spotting analogy I think is great, but it really can go even further with the whole idea of a trainer, right? There are weaknesses that you have. There are things that you're going to slip up on that you may not notice, and having somebody that you're working very closely with side by side, and you're both doing this work, and you can kind of point those things out to one another, and you have that trust in that relationship to be able to do it, and then also be there when people, when you mess up and when you get called to task. And sometimes you're both going to mess up and get called to task.
Sometimes it's a student that holds you accountable, like we've experienced on a couple of occasions. Shout out to Seattle to Selma crew, holding us accountable for the work there.
Yeah. So if you're gonna be doing this work as a white educator, if you're gonna be trying to dismantle systems of white supremacy, you really need to find some way to keep yourself accountable. But also to have that external influence to be able to check in and see how you're doing. So thanks again for joining us. We'll see when we get to the next one at some point, but we'll be back with number 7.